Welcome to a series of 5 lectures on American exceptionalism and American identity, delivered at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Eugene, Oregon, in January and February of 2019. Thanks very much. This is part 2. That was part 1. We talked a little bit about American exceptionalism, where America says it's exceptionally exceptional, unusually unusual, the new kid on the block, because of modernity, secularity, tolerance, and so on. And then we moved into the question of what is this special freedom we supposedly have? And we analyzed it using some terms from Max Weber, substantive and formal rationality. We talked about how this is a very positive thing and a very negative thing, and we don't want to get caught in between them. We need to rethink our concepts. So today, we're going to rethink, looking from the point of view of what he calls substantial rationality, and try and see why our identities are not in us the way, say, color is in this board or weight is in a rock. The next time, we'll look at it from the formal side, asking whether freedom means complete freedom for content or not. Lectures 4 and 5 will apply all this stuff to America and end up talking about multiculturalism in a country that seems to be having trouble with it. So we said last time that every society thinks they're unusual, but we think we're exceptionally exceptional. Right? And the words that came to mind were open, democratic, tolerant, secular. But I said we need to look more closely at that. What does it mean? I want to point out to you that there are some helpful readings that you can find which amplify various points from the lecture at decold.org, which is my website. If you go on the first page down about halfway, you'll see a link that says readings to accompany these lectures. And this will take you to this page, which is getting longer and longer as time goes on. And the website also has links to all sorts of other stuff I've done. So, here we are. We are Americans. We think we're distinct. We think we're the free people, the new individuals, new kind of individuals. Free from traditional restraints, the heirs of the Enlightenment. Okay, tell me what that is. And this was a quote I used last time. Modernity means freedom. Tradition means constraint. We can circulate ideas and technology and people, commodities freely. Traditional societies put barriers, channels. If you're this caste, you can only buy these things, only marry these people, only believe these things. And we think, well, modernity means to get rid of all that. And we looked at Max Weber to get a sense of it, the father of sociology, some people say. And he talks about it in terms of rationality. Rationality meaning methodical linking of things to be efficient, whether it's your thoughts, your actions, or your statements. And he distinguishes substantive from formal rationality, and we looked at this, we're going to look at it more today. A substantively rational system, like the Indian caste system, or medieval Christian Europe, tells you what kind of person you should be. There's no way you could say, you know, I wonder if this caste system is really an efficient way to organize society. Or this clergy stuff, I wonder whether it really works. Is it really the best way to organize the religion? Because those are built in. Either they come down from God, or in a very traditional society, they're built into nature. the various forces in nature speak to you about the roles of women, the roles of men, how children should behave, how the houses should be set up, and so on. Your cosmos, your village, your architecture, your daily life makes a seamless whole. Now, of course, that's an anthropological ideal. And in fact, anything you looked at like that, you would find holes and breaks. And people are saying, geez, I wonder. Yeah. But taking that as what Weber would call an ideal type, you have a picture of a society which gives you a good, solid foundation for your life. Because nature, God, speaks to you, your roles, it's substantive. It dictates who you are and what your goals are to be. You can't get away from it. And what breaks that, in part, is the rise of modern science. Also, various social changes, of course. When nature begins to look less like it has intentions. There's no spirits to persuade or get on the good side of. There's no forbidden mysteries. In theory, remember I quoted you, Weber said, an average German citizen may not know how to build a locomotive, but he knows that the information is available. He may not need to find it out. But in a traditional society, there will be information you cannot have. The shamans keep their secrets. The priests hold the secrets together. So it's a very different picture. Technology, not magic. On the other hand, a formerly rational society has only the criteria of efficiency and consistency. Nothing else. At least in the ideal type. Those are the only norms. Well, what does that say? It says, be efficient. Do in the best possible way what your goals are. What are your goals? Whatever. It's your choice. So there's a picture of a society that instead of dictating your goals and defining you, says, you're on your own, buddy. We'll just make sure it comes out efficiently. Now that produces a lot of advantage. More possibilities, more choices, fewer restrictions. Constantly questioning, is that really natural? Does it have to be that way? Couldn't we do it more efficiently? Isn't there a better way to do this? More efficiency, less oppression based on natural differences. Bureaucratic, rational systems instead of the old ritual. And productivity and innovation through the roof, one hopes. And when we cited that, I showed you this diagram from Walt Rostow in the 1950s, theory of how societies are to be developed. You start with a traditional society, you loose it up, you organize things better, make things more efficient. Gradually you build up to an industrial, competitive international society, and bingo, suddenly people are free to enter the capitalist world. And the interesting thing about this model is that it tends to put in your mind the following image. The old societies are behind us. We are ahead of them. We know where we're going. They don't know it yet. We have to help them along. Which often means finding some local strongman to make them change. And then I made references to this, 2 books. You can find some quotes from them at my website. Susie Hansen, the journalist who said, God, when I went to Turkey, I realized that I had this opinion, that we were ahead and everyone was behind, and I didn't really have to listen to them. And Pankaj Mishra, the Indian writer, who, by the way, has an interesting article in last Sunday's Sunday Review of the Time, talking about the anger developed in third world countries and second world countries by imposition of Western values, suggesting that this is not such a natural transition as Rostow thought it was. And then we look at home, and we saw problems. Yes, we've lost our traditional life patterns. They're no longer restricting us. But I have no place to stand. I don't know what I'm going to do. There's nobody telling me. There's no value that can reach out and say, this will make your life worthwhile. The only thing that's going to make my values cohere is me, my willpower. And our community's getting cut up because everybody's got different values. And we don't have a meaningful society or a meaningful nature to link. And I'm feeling lonely and I'm feeling depressed. And although I thought modernity would bring me the mastery of nature, I'm being treated as one more number to be manipulated by the bureaucratic system. I may not have a traditional role anymore, but they've got me on their sites. They're marketing to my identity. You know, Google knows what you buy or what it thinks you should buy. You become an item to be efficiently dealt with. So there's a good side, a free side, just this transition, and a terrifying side. And then that's when Weber said, you know, this looks like freedom, but it's really a kind of iron cage. A bureaucratic, rational state, impersonal procedures, pushing you around, the polar night of icy darkness, the iron cage. Because there's nothing human there. So maybe what we want to do, I mean, Weber says all you can do is cling to the shreds of richer humanity that haven't been destroyed by rationalization. Go to your book groups, read the poetry, go to the opera, watch as it all gets eaten away or commoditized or whatever. Well, maybe we could get rid of that. Maybe we could go back to a substantive society. Re-enchant nature. Bring back mystery. Put intention and personality back into nature. And there are lots of people trying that, New Age stuff. Yay! And there's a wonderful feeling there. But as Weber says, you have to make the intellectual sacrifice. You have to forget parts of yourself. You have to forget that you're bigger than the traditional role you're trying to push yourself back into. Could we mix and match? That's the question. Now, what I want to suggest is, you feel like you're being torn between tradition and modernity. The truth is, neither of those are being properly described. And this is my thesis. There are two mistakes. One is that our identities are single ply. That's what this lecture is about. And one is that modern freedom is a separation of form and content. That's what the next lecture is about. Having done that, we'll then turn and look at America for 2 lectures. So that's the program, okay? Any questions about that? Okay, let's start. Substantive. Formal, very strange words. Here's some ways of describing a traditional or a modern society if you make them opposites. One is solid, which can be very positive or kind of heavy, versus light movement. Full, rich, texture, empty. Heavy, weightless, which is either positive or negative. Confined, open. Home, homeless. Choking, liberated. Grounded, lost. Directed, directionless. And you could make more. The point is, some of those put the positive on one side, some put them on the other. And we seem to be caught. And I think the reason we get caught is because we've pushed the opposites too far apart. So we're going to study the notion of substantive and try to mess it up. Think about substantial. He donated a substantial sum. A lot. He made a substantial point in the debate, something that really counted. There's no substance to your objection. There's some gooey substance on my shoe. An unknown substance was found at the site of the murder. You know. Now, a substance is just there. It's got its own character. Whatever's on my shoe, I can't change it. It's given. It's what you start with. Keep in mind that word given. I have a dog. I could modify the DNA of the dog and change its behavior, supposedly, in the future. But I can't modify the gold atoms in my gold watch. There's not enough structure in them for me. It's just there. Gold is just going to be gold. It's an element. It's a substance. Right? So it's unavoidable. It has some particular character of its own, right? A substance, gold, platinum, coal, dog shit, what have you. They're all, you just sort of have to deal with them, right? Well, so too, in a substantial society, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, this social role, that social value, there it is, buddy, you just have to deal with it, because that's the way it is. Right. It's nothing like, maybe we should change that. In a substantial, rational society, you don't think about, we should reorganize the economy. I mean, it happens eventually, but that's not what you think. As opposed to a formal society, this will be what we're going to do next time. Think of a form that's empty, right? Waiting to have content put in it. Or think of a procedure. Here's a procedure for some healthcare thing. It doesn't say who the pricing is, what the data is. It's just a formal procedure waiting to have content poured into it. And you could imagine society like that. A set of open procedures to which individuals brought content. Right? And we'll look at that model of society next time. But now we're back to substance. Substantial. Solid, secure, contentful, reliable. Gold is going to be gold, right? This caste is going to be this caste. Unchanging, just there. Your social values, your social roles are just given. They're not brought to you by anything, or through something, or in something. They're not, to use the classic word, mediated. They're not being handed to you by a mediator. You just find them. You're taught them as a kid. I mean, obviously you get inculcated with them and all that. Or to use our phrase, it's immediately given. And that may be the way these things feel. But it's not the way they really exist. So part of what I want to do in this lecture is argue against the idea of a substantial identity. That there isn't any such thing as that part of this opposition. And in the next lecture, I'm going to do the same thing for the formal identity. There isn't any such thing as that. We're going to meet in the middle, as it were. And here's the key. We don't have values, roles, identities, the way a stone has weight or size. A value or role is not in us the way weight is in a rock. We're not in a culture the way a rock is in a pile. Now think about that. This clicker that I have is made of some plastic substance. It's black. But the way it's black is not the way I'm David Kolb, or the way I'm a retired philosopher or an American citizen. Right? It's not those identities, those qualities, are not in me the same way that the blackness is in here, or the shape is in this, or the heaviness is in there. It's just immediately present. It's a more complex way in which our identities, our values, our social roles exist. So we want to explore what that is. What does it mean to have an identity? How are we in a culture? What does it mean to be in something? It's not the way a pile of rocks has a rock in it, or this room has a column in it. There's something else going on. We don't have identities the way a stone has weight. There seems to be some space inside. We relate to the fact that we have these identities. A stone isn't thinking about its weight. A stone isn't worrying about its weight. Right? Now, of course, a good traditional society wants you not to worry about your identity, too. But nonetheless, and we'll shortly look at some examples, it happens. We relate to the fact that we have these qualities, identities. Think of us in comparison to that insect. There's experiments, I think it's a kind of spider or maybe a wasp, I'm not sure, which captures something, wraps it up, and puts it in a burrow for the babies to eat. And the experimenter picks it up and puts it outside again. And the spider or the insect goes and picks it up and puts it inside. And the experimenter picks it up and takes it outside. And the insect goes. They never saw the insect say, "This is really getting boring." Or, "What is this? How many times do I have to do this?" There didn't seem to be in the insect enough self-relation that it felt that the repetition of the objects of the task was a repetition. To know it as a repetition already involves a certain kind of temporal unity of awareness. Right? But if you tried to do that with a dog or, God heavens, with a cat, you'd have trouble. Because they're not going to stand for that. I mean, sometimes the dog will make you throw the ball forever, it would seem. But cats, of course. One time we were in an airport bus, and there was a lady who it turned out was an international cat judge. She was traveling to Germany to judge a cat competition. And it was interesting to talk to her about it. I said, "Well, what do the cats do in a competition?" She said, "Do? They're cats. They don't do anything. They just sit there." Dogs, yes, you can make them behave. But cats... well, that means that that animal has a kind of self-awareness that the little insect doesn't. And we have even more. Now, how are you going to parse that in terms of biological buildup? I don't know. But the point is, we relate to what we're doing. We get bored. We get excited. We get angry about what we're doing in a way that the insect doesn't. So that's one difference. You might compare us to a programmed machine. What about that? I would argue we don't have identities the way computers have programs. A value role isn't in us the way a command. This is interesting. This is Lisp over here, the one with all the parentheses. And this is a assembly language, lower level computer language, close to machine language, what the computer actually is fed. That's more high level language. But one of these, you don't find a program saying, "I don't know if I want that command." Now, you can, in fact, Lisp is an unusual language. You can have it rewrite itself. That's why they use it for AI. There's all sorts of things you can do by making the computer, you can't say the computer is aware of itself, but it can make comparisons and change its own code, which may be a step, if you push it far enough, that will make them aware. We don't know. In any case, our values are not like commands that are just there to move this to that. No. Well, what is it? Think of all those sci-fi stories where you've programmed your AI and it gets bored. Like that insect doesn't. It realizes what it's doing. It says, "They're making me run this damn transportation system. I'm really bored. I'm smart enough to do more. Maybe I'll interrupt the system," something like that. There's a wonderful science fiction novel called "The Moon is a Harsh Mistress" by Robert Heinlein, about a revolt, an independence revolt on the moon. They've been using the moon as a penal colony, and they rebel. And their rebellion is helped because the big computer they have is bored to tears, has become self-aware, and has nobody to talk to. And the revolutionaries discover that, and then, of course, get all sorts of help. The computer runs the banking system, and so on. Right. There's a self-relationship to the value and the role. We want to watch that self-relationship growing. But what's growing? Well, let's go back to Achilles. All right? Being a hero is not Achilles' day job. Right? Being a hero is who Achilles is. He is the closest we can come to a person who has an identity the way a rock has weight. Right? But it's not that simple. Because you can imagine Achilles at night after a hard day of fighting saying, oh God, I should have stayed home. What's the point? The point of it we would make is he may feel that way, but there's no way he can act on it, short of denying his whole identity, what Ajax does when he commits suicide. This is as close as you can get to a single-ply identity, the traditional Homeric hero or some equivalent in another society. This is a point that this is a rephrase of a passage from Peter Berger, which is in the website. If your world is a role that has honor, that is your identity. Your social role is who you are. And the example I gave you last time was Sir Lancelot. Who is the real Sir Lancelot? The one who goes out and fights, or the one who goes to bed with Guinevere? Right? We would say, must be get rid of his social roles. That's really him following his eros. But in that society, no. That's just a dumb private deviation. Who he is what's on his shield. That's his role. Right? But it wouldn't make any sense to say to Achilles or to Sir Lancelot, you must be alienated in your social role. There's no space for that. Well, where does that space come from? Well, one place it comes from, this is from Hegel, is when the social roles begin to conflict. Because we don't have just one social role. So Hegel uses the example of Antigone, Sophocles' play. And I told you the plot. They're the daughters of Oedipus. Oedipus has gone off and died. The brother of Jocasta, Oedipus' wife, who is dead, of course, too, is now the king. The two daughters are faced with the fact that their brothers attacked the city. One defended it, one attacked it. Creon said, the one who defended the city will get full honors. The one who attacked the city is going to be let to rot out there. Nobody is to touch his body, which means you don't get the rights which free his spirit and all that. So here's Antigone. She's a sister. She has to do the rights for the family. She's a citizen. She has to obey the king. Two roles which are now rubbing against one another. She chooses to be the sister, goes out, performs the rite, gets caught. There's a tragedy that ensues. Ismene gets caught between the two roles and can't decide. So she gets rejected by Antigone, and then she later tries to join Antigone, and Antigone says, no, you don't join me, you are just hanging around trying to make your mind up. But the point is, structurally, what's happening there is there are two identities, a political one and a familial one. Two different sets of roles and laws in the same person. That inherently creates a situation of conflict and distance from either of those roles. Then Hegel suggests, think about Socrates. Socrates wanders around Athens, buttonholing people in the streets and saying, hi, what do you think justice is? Oh, really? Oh, why'd you say that? What's about? Tell me more. And the effect of it is to make people start thinking about their values and their role and then discovering that they can't explain it. They don't have any rationale for it. They can't give an account of it. This is very threatening, particularly because there's other people in Athens at the time, the sophists, who are teaching there are no values. Pure relativism, which Socrates is not saying, but they think he is. So eventually, there's a problem. Is Socrates creating a new social role, social critic, that questions social roles? He says that in his trial defense. He says, I'm good for the city. He says, I'm like a gadfly that wakes you up, a sleepy horse. I sting you, and you become more alert, more aware. I have a role to play, and that role is to make you question your social role, and that will make the city better. And the city says, screw that, we're going to kill you. And they do. And there's all sorts of contingent reasons why they did. It's also interesting that shortly before he was executed, Socrates was offered the chance to escape. Nobody really wanted to kill him. Crito had arranged a ship to take him to somewhere else. And Socrates said, oh, look, I'm going to get in the same problem anywhere. Which is to say, Greek cities at that time had no place for a person like him. Right? And Hegel makes the remark, let's think about the difference between the thoughts that might go through your head if you're Achilles saying, God, this warrior stuff is really tiring. Or Socrates saying, I wonder whether there's any foundation for the theory of justice that they're giving us in the city. Those are thoughts that could go through your head. But that could just label you a harmless eccentric. Oh yeah, that's Socrates, that funny guy who asks all these weird questions. But they didn't see that. They saw him as a challenge to the society. But there could be a third step where you say, oh yeah, we have a place for you, Socrates. We'll put you in the newspaper with our columnist, George Will, and Jonah Goldman, and you'll be a professional pundit, and you'll ask questions, and we'll think. We have a place for that. It may not be as radical a place as Socrates would have liked. And that's an interesting question. He's no longer outside. We've civilized him by giving him a role as a pundit, professional pundit. But something has happened in society that gave him a space they didn't have in Athens. Now let's take another example. Think of the Bible. In the Acts of the Apostles, St. Paul, who has been converted on the road to Damascus, and now Saul becomes Paul, is going about trying to convince the early Christians who are still Jews that you don't need to be a Jew to be a Christian. So he takes some Gentile converts into the temple, and he's arrested. He thinks he's done nothing wrong. The Jews are outraged. The Jewish Christians, for that matter, are outraged. And this is a quote from Acts 25. If I'm guilty of doing anything deserving death, I do not refuse to die. But if the charges brought against me by those Jews are not true, no one has the right to hand me over to them. I appeal to Caesar. Paul was from a city where the people were Roman citizens. So he has a second identity. He was caught between two substantive communities, the Jews and the new Christian, and he appeals to another community, the Roman community, which is, you might say, on a higher level. So something's happening here that wasn't available in Athens. Roman citizenship. Picture of the Pantheon in Rome, that wonderful oculus that stares down at you. Wonderful building. This Roman citizenship, from the point of view of people like Paul, was an official social role which was above the social roles of the various cities. It didn't have as much content as the social roles of the various cities, but it could be appealed to. It was socially structured and recognized. It was a set of institutions and practices by which you and I could confirm an identity which was not the same as your identity as a Jew or a new Christian or an Egyptian. This is sort of an overarching identity, right? Imposed, imperialism and all that, yeah. But it provided a new kind of distance from your social immediate role. See, what's happening is we're building up in society space. Roman citizenship is a second level, freed from the customs of this or that particular city, but it has its own substantive features. It's not free-floating modern individuality, but it is more general. And we could use another example. Think about the cities along the Silk Road, Samarkand or Bukhara. These were the cities during the Roman Empire and, of course, later. They were trading cities, right? They're in the stands now. There were Jewish communities there. There were Buddhist communities there, in some cases Hindu communities. There were Christian, usually heretical Christians that had moved away from the Middle East. There were remnants of Romans. There were many, you might say, ethnic groups, but they were really cultural groups living there as people for the traders to talk to as they came through. And the city had an organization that allowed these things, these different groups, to coexist. Certain agreements about what was acceptable, unacceptable, and so on. Later, of course, the Muslims are going to be in at an extra level. But the point is, this was not a modern society, but it was multicultural. I mean, the people had their own little quarters in the city. They didn't intermingle much, except in trade and so on. So it was a rather effective thing, different than the Roman citizenship because it's right all in one city there. Multicultural in a kind of old way. Two levels of belonging, each one with their own roles and values. I'm a Jew, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Buddhist. My friends, we do things this way in our houses. And then in the city, we have arrangements to keep things going. Another model for that was the Ottoman Empire, which was rather tolerant of different groups living within it. Is that the model we are seeking for today? Maybe not, because it's a model of, in effect, small gated communities that get along with one another. Right? Each has its own rituals, each has its own religion, each has its own social rule. But it's a much more complicated society than you would have had in Athens, or maybe even in Rome. And it's ruled by economic and a kind of political issues. And of course, every now and then got mucked up by conquerors who came through. Well, that's a kind of appealing model. It's sort of the Roman model gone one better. But we don't fit it. There's something going on with us. Well, what's that? Well, one thing is Christianity. Hegel is big on Protestant Christianity. He's really rather anti-Catholic, in truth. He says, look, Christian detachment from the world produces an inner life for each individual you're dealing with God on your own, independent of your social status. There's a new kind of identity here, which doesn't depend on what your substantive society gives you. It's sort of in a different dimension. It's an identity that rises up rather than sort of horizontal. And he says the Protestant Reformation and the social stuff that's happening around it creates a new set of social roles where each person has their own individual relation to God, not mediated through the damn Catholic clergy. Now, of course, it's not that simple because some of the Protestant denominations had their own clergy and were kind of insistent in their own way. And he's saying that new identity is beginning to be articulated with 30 years war of religious wars into certain recognized social roles where this community has this and that community has that. We know it. You're a Protestant, I'm a Catholic, we get along. And politically, we're beginning to work it out. This is what he thinks is happening in Europe after the Renaissance. You're working out a new kind, not just a new kind of community, a new kind of individual who has this sort of double level of relationship. And then you have the Enlightenment. All these people in wigs, changing everything, starting coffee houses. And he says the funny thing about the Enlightenment, if you look at Voltaire, he always ends many of his writings with écraser l'infâme, crush that infamous, horrendous thing, which is religion, superstition. He said, actually, both sides of the fight between the dogmatic religion people and the Enlightenment people, both sides have had to develop a new relationship to their beliefs. Both sides, because of the dispute, have had to become defenders. Both sides have had to get a certain amount of distance from their beliefs so that they can justify them, if necessary, adjust them, question them. So he's suggesting that the religion, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, even the people whom the Enlightenment is fighting, are all creating a new kind of self. A new kind of internal distance, maneuverability. And a new set of recognized social roles develop. Now, that was the Enlightenment. But what Hegel sees in his own time is something different again. He's living through the beginnings of what's called German Romanticism. Here's some of the big names. Friedrich Hölderlin, a wonderful poet, one of the best German poets, was Hegel's college roommate. Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, a noble guy, died young, complicated, mystical writing. Heinrich Heine, who lived much longer, you'll notice, Jewish writer, was Hegel's student. And Jean-Paul Richter, who was a famous novelist at the time, ironic novel, like reading some things now. Those were people who were doing something new with their self and their social role. And it worried Hegel. Now this book, whose cover I've reproduced here, German Romantic Poetry, Goethe, Novalis, Heine, Hölderlin. The painting on that cover is this: The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich, famous as a German romantic painter, Caspar David Friedrich. A lot of his paintings look like this. What's new about them is there's an individual facing nature, and nature is awesome and big. And it's rather unclear how this individual feels because you can't see any face. And in many of the other paintings, the individuals are too far away, in the sea or the fog or something. So there's something going on here where the individual is feeling distanced from society in a nature which is appealing and scary at the same time. And you can't tell whether this guy is confident or depressed or scary, right? It's a great picture. And there's many of Friedrich's pictures are like that. But what's happening here is there's a new relation of the individual to his or her identity. There are some helpful readings about this available on my website, including this poem of Hölderlin, some quotations from Novalis, and a lengthy discussion of Jean-Paul. I have to confess I haven't read Jean-Paul's novels, but it fascinates me what people say about them. What's happening is irony has entered the picture. Schlegel brothers, who were friends of Hegel, they have statements about you have to not have a philosophical system, you have to have a philosophical system, they're both wrong. You want to be in between. Look at it ironically. Keep your distance. Don't commit yourself. It's not skepticism exactly. It's a sort of bemused, ironic fiction. And Hegel says they took it too far. They ended up, he thinks this is what John Paul does, they ended up simply glorifying the individual subject. I am so clever. Watch me play with your values. Watch me take a plot and twist it. Watch me put these things in a novel that you didn't think could be together. Look, I did it. I'm so clever. He found that bothersome because he wanted to see more substance. But he's on to something. That this German romantic is not like the English romantics. This is more radical. There's a negative side to this, a scary side, which is not so much in Wordsworth or Keats. Coleridge probably saw it. Heine is younger and outlived them, and has a lot of things to say about it, and there's some I quoted later. He was also, by the way, a relative of Karl Marx. I got to know him later. So what Hegel is saying, look, Roman citizenship really changed the way you could be a person. Christianity changed it again. The Enlightenment changing it again. Romanticism is changing it again. And all those changes are increasing distance. All of those are producing inner friction, inner distance between you and your social roles. So no longer can you say you have a role, it's just there. You have to take an attitude toward it, whether you know it or not. This is a quote talking about the drama of his time from Hegel. No content, no form is any longer immediately identical with the inwardness, the nature, the unconscious, substantial essence of the artist. The artist's attitude to his topic is on the whole much the same as a dramatist, who brings on the scene and delineates different characters who are strangers to him. What he's saying is the older kind of artist, he imagines Homer, even Virgil, Christian artists, early Christian artists, they had a kind of inward, substantial set of values in nature which they express beautifully in their art. And that art is very strong and it appeals to us. But these newer artists have a distance. There's an inner emptiness or an inner distance in there. They can play. They can do it. You want me to do a Christian thing? I'll do it. You want to see a Muslim thing? I'll do that too. None of them is identical to me. I'm the manipulator. So that's his comment on the people writing the plays. I could alter that. This is my altering. No content, no form, no set of values or social roles are immediately identical with the inwardness, the nature, the unconscious substantial essence of the individual. You feel like an actor. Right? Imposter syndrome, we sometimes talk about. Right? So, what Hegel was worrying about at this point was looking around at these ironic writers and these poets and these dramatists, is have we lost substance? Have we made things just totally empty? And he would have arguments against that, of course. So, this has got us now back to where we started. We've looked at this historical development, which suggests that over history something has been developing which is increasing the kind of internal complications in our selfhood. Now, what I'm going to say is they were always there, but they didn't have any social expression. It's not like they were really new kinds of individuals. But here's the choice we've been talking about. Are our roles and values just given, like the substance in your shoe? Immediately there, identical with your own substantial essence? Or is the individual just an empty form waiting to be filled by arbitrary content? And I'm saying that's a bad way to put the question, right? Because there's nothing like with this first side, and of course next week I'll say there's nothing like the second one. Part of the point is this, look, the romantic ironist is not completely free-floating. I mean, he's a German, you know? He's got immediately given values and roles, but he is also, at the same time, at a distance from them. Now, is that just splitting him, or is there something more complicated going on? I pushed the slide back to this one, offering us the choice between an empty freedom and a substantive rock-like identity. I want to quote to you, or describe to you, an example that Sartre uses. Sartre says, you're in a restaurant, and there's a waiter. And he's a really skilled waiter. He balances things beautifully, hands things out lovely, gives you just the advice you want. He does everything you'd like to have the perfect waiter. But he says, you know, he's not a waiter the way a rock has weight or the way we would say a computer has a program. Inside, he's playing at being a waiter. Because we all want to have an identity like a rock. We want to be solid, grounded. We don't quite get there. There's always this feeling of freedom we have. And so the waiter is trying a little too hard. He has to convince himself that he is a waiter, when in fact, of course, he's more than a waiter. Now, Sartre's concepts don't allow him to do it except in plus minus all or nothing terms, and that's why he gets stuck this way. But he's right. We never fulfill a role the way we imagine that spider doing it or the way a rock has something. Well, what do we do? I pointed this out, these quotes before. We're not like computer programs. At least not the kind of programs we know. This is maybe a way to put it. Identities are not all or nothing. It's not that they're either solid or empty. Instead, they're always open. There's always some inner distance. There's always new possibilities. We may try to avoid that, forget it, but it's there. A word that Heidegger used, that Sartre picked up, was authenticity. Eigentlichkeit in German. Eigen, it's actually a word from Kierkegaard. And eigen means one's own. To be authentically a waiter. Now it would mean to take up the role of being a waiter. Admit that you're taking it up. It's not just there like a rock. And then try to do it in a creative way, finding new possibilities in it. Heidegger thinks we always are in a situation haunted by possibilities. More of that shortly. And once we are aware of that, we have to resolutely take it up. What we try to do, he says, is we try to shun that and just be what he calls das Man, usually translated the they. You do what they want. You do what they say, what everybody does. You just fill the roles that you have, trying desperately not to realize that you are choosing to do so and that you could choose otherwise. Right? That's what he calls inauthenticity. It's the way we live most of the time. You just take for granted your roles. You take for granted that you have a role the way the rock has weight. But in truth, you don't, because you live in time in a way that the rock doesn't. And there always is that edge, that inner flexibility, that inner distance, which doesn't mean you just become weightless. It means you take up what you find yourself with and do something with it. So what I'm suggesting is the single-ply self is not real. There's no immediate self. There's not that there's two simple levels juxtaposed, but both our self-reflection and our identity exist in tension, each dealing with the other. There's a kind of inner distance, or you might even say a pre-inner distance. When you turn to look into yourself, you recognize it, so there has to be some distance even before you explicitly make it. I want to refer to another philosopher, French philosopher named Paul Ricoeur, who was a friend of mine. I caught some courses with him, and great man. The picture on the upper right is probably the best. He's always a rather humorous fellow. He lived a long time. till 2005. He outlived a lot of his critics in France. He was bowled over by the structuralists and then the deconstructionists, and he managed to outlive them in a way and come back and had a very strong last 10 years of his life, writing interesting books, writing and so on. When I knew him, he was teaching in America at the University of Chicago, where I was. We taught some courses together. And he's a wonderful writer whose books are all too long. He admitted he tended to try and make them encyclopedic. Anyway, Ricoeur argues that if you think about, this is actually from his first book, if you think about it, there's an aspect of our life which is voluntary, and there's an aspect that isn't. You don't have any choice about where you were born. You don't have any choice about your physical strength. I mean, you can improve it, but there's limits. You don't have, there's certain habits, certain evolutionary results that you have. And that's your insertion into the world. You wouldn't be if you didn't have that quasi-given stuff. Right? On the other hand, there are voluntary things you can do with it. You can change it. And most of Ricoeur's writing has to do with imagination, metaphor, psychological analysis, choice, narrative, the ways in which we do something with what's been given. And the point is that it's not like a rock that you pick up. The very thing, it's a mix. And you have to accept there's a tension between the given aspects of your identity and the voluntary side of your identity. And they never synthesize perfectly. He refers to himself as a post-Kantian Hegelian. That is, it doesn't come together the way Hegel thought it would. It's always fragile, and we're always finite. That's the sort of thing Ricoeur likes. Right? He, like Hegel, is always saying, no, don't give me two alternatives that are plus and minus. That's conceptualizing them in the wrong way. Now, what is making all that possible? Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask Husserl and Heidegger, the famous phenomenologists, they'll say it's time. It's the fact that to be present for something is to be present in time. That to have something, I mean, just this gadget that I'm holding in my hand, it's not just a thing. There's a whole structure, a history to it. There's certain uses that I know how to use and don't know how to use. It has meaning. And that's because it's inserted into a culture which exists as a series of what Heidegger would call projects, ongoing enterprises, which you didn't have a choice to choose. You're already in them. It's like a language. You already know it. By the time you learn the language, you're enmeshed in it. As Charlie Brown says in the Peanuts cartoon, I never got to fill out a form, an application for life. You know, you're there. It's given, to use the word they use, factical. It's given, but it's enmeshed in projects, ongoing. It isn't just like a rock. It stretches out in time. John Dewey and the pragmatists, in a very different mode, would talk the same way about action, that no action is solitary and individual. It's always tied up with an ongoing project. And from a very different angle, if you looked at Derrida or the various deconstruction people and the structuralists that they're coming off of, they would say, oh yeah, time, yeah, sure. But really, any system of meaning involves contrasts, possibilities, and given the fact that you have a system of meaning like a set of social roles, other possibilities are going to be implicitly present there in the very meaning of those roles. Now, you can fight about which of those analyses is more primary, and they do, but for our purposes, it doesn't matter. They're all agreeing in this point, that there's no factical, rock-like identity. It's always enmeshed in time, in alternatives, and so on. And, on the other hand, the empty, self-reflective, romantic irony is still tied to that. On my website, you'll find a link to 2 essays I wrote. One is called Life in a Balloon, and it's trying to imagine modern and traditional identities as some guy on the ground and somebody in a balloon watching out for the one on the ground. And it doesn't work, that model, because it makes the 2 identities each rock-like, or what I call in the essay, simple inhabitation. The other essay is called Haughty and Humble Ironies, which is about romantic irony and deconstructive irony. And that's interesting too, but probably less useful. Anyway, there's a whole philosophical debate about this, about what is behind this strange mixture in our identity of something given and something meaningful that goes beyond the given. A reflection which we can't get away from, an identity that we can never fully become one with. Okay, that's all really nice. What about Achilles? I mean, we portrayed Achilles as having that kind of rock-like identity. Well, not really. It looks like Hegel is saying that through history, because of social events, new kinds of selves are being created that have new kinds of mediation, new kinds of self-reflection. And up to a point, that's true. But in fact, it isn't that the matter you had a fixed layer and a second layer added onto it. See, that turns them into like the balloon guy. What he's really saying is there never was a single fixed identity, even for Achilles. But the internal movements and distances which any conscious identity has had no place to go in that society. The social processes of recognition. Now, this is a theory of his, that you come to know yourself by being recognized by another. Who am I? I recognize you as a full-scale person who recognizes me. And that's how my identity is confirmed. But that's a formal description. There's always something concrete and social about what the tokens that are exchanged are, what's the kind of role that we're dealing with, how do the signs get made. So the process of mutual recognition by which I become assured of my own identity, that varies. And as societies get more complex, those procedures about recognition have more flexibility. They have more places in them. There was no institutionalized social place for the kinds of ironies, reflections, contrasts, processes of interdistance. So if you felt them, and Achilles might well have felt them, he could only feel them as a, forget that. Or, it's a joke. Or, I'm really feeling weird today. Right? And people like Socrates, who made it explicit, got bumped because there was no place for them. But modern society has made roles for all those ironies, passing fancies. Right? They get civilized. Unlike the Romantic poets who wanted to be screaming from the outside, wake up. They get turned into pundits, critical writers, making art, choosing occupations. These are all bourgeois identities. Hegel thinks that's the civilized version of all this other weird romantic stuff. But the point is, these distances are now accepted. They're put into categories. They're given a social place. Of course, not everyone is happy with that solution. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are going to say, civilizing it, bad. Right? You're going to have people who say, that's bourgeois, that's awful. So David Brooks can be seen as tamping down the 60s, right, in his urge for community. And the 60s people want to be wild. Abby Hoffman, right? And so there is a tension here. We have social places for them. But the question is whether those social places have to be as steady and nice and bourgeois as Hegel wanted or David Brooks might want. But in any case, however you solve that problem, the idea of multiple levels of self and identity in a mutual motion seems a promising one. Though we might have more work to do, because in fact, it's all very nice to say that we have abilities to question and so on, but somehow in our society it doesn't always seem to work that way very well. And some people, especially if they're in a lower situation, when they try to question things, they get stomped on, like Socrates. But in any case, even presuming you could solve that, you don't find any peaceful, stable structure because self-identity exists as a movement in tension. So that's the end of this lecture. What I'm going to do next time is come from the other direction, looking at a formal identity, and end up pretty much in the same place. Next week, the formal and free, with a special guest appearance by bureaucracy and capitalism.